My name is Aras Sarafian, and I am the Executive Director of the Gomidas Institute in London, UK. Today, we will be launching the English translation of Senekerim Khederian's A Brief History of Nirze village in Gesaria, that's Kayseri in central Turkey. Before I introduce our guest, I'd like to thank the Armenian Studies program in Fresno, as well as Bardo Dermagadichyan and of course, Harry Persikian, who made this publication possible. This project would not have seen the light of day without them. Our distinguished guest speakers are first Gesaria Libaridian. When I first saw his CV, and I couldn't even begin to cut it down to a few sentences, so I'll introduce him as I know him. Gerard is a historian by training. He's a distinguished former diplomat and presidential advisor in Armenia. We are very lucky that he undertook the translation, annotation, and of course, the introduction of his publication. His introduction is an eye-opener and instructive for future students of history how to read this type of material. As for Harry Persikian, first time I'm meeting him here, he's an intrepid retired businessman and a Nirzetsi by descent. He is what I call a peace activist who visits and has good relations in Turkey. And he's a former head of the Nirze Educational Society. So this should be an interesting discussion between us, history, social, and of course, even political issues related to this book and Nirze. I'd like to start by asking Dr. Libaridian to perhaps give us a few pointers about where this book comes from. When was it put together? Why was it written? And what kind of materials did it draw on? I think some of you have seen the book, but many of you have not. So perhaps Gerard can give a short introduction and we can start our discussion from there.
Thank you, Ara. It's a pleasure to join here and talk about this little book. Let me begin by saying I'm not a Nirzetsi, but with close association with Harry Persikian, I consider myself an honorary one. This is a book that's less than 100 pages, but it has so many dimensions. It was I did it because I wanted to get my mind away from the war in September 2020. That was a devastating thing for all of us. And although you may think that leaving a war with defeat, going to a story that hovers around the genocide is not the best R&R, but still I tell you that there's so much in this book that is fantastic, that it really brought me back to the reading of history, primary sources, and to the making of a history of a book that is relevant to history. Let me go quickly through the various dimensions of the book. First of all, it's a story about a village near the very important city of Gesaria, Kayseri, the ancient Caesarea, and a village where there's, it's not a small one, about 150, 160 Armenian families and probably equal amount of Turkish families, and some 800 in those families. And it's the story on how it came to be. Of course, it relies on old sources, Khederian does, but also how it basically disintegrates. This is very important because it covers quite a bit of the pre-genocide period. And in doing so, it shows how families lived, how they made a living, how they fell apart, and how about 70 of the young men of the families ended up in the United States, mostly in Watertown, Mass, working in one factory, which was quite common for people from the same village to congregate and live in one town or city. It is not the idealized village. It is not the idealized family. The book was commissioned in 1917 by the Nirze factory workers to one among them, also a factory worker, who might be called the Krotsprots, someone who knew how to read and write, not a particularly intellectualized person, but someone with a decent education. They asked him to write about the village because they were hearing about the massacres and deportations. They didn't know whether their village existed or not. They couldn't find much information about their families. And there was this sense that something big is happening to their village and families. Their lives are about to change, and the lives of Armenians are about to change. And so there's this sense that they want to capture the moment of their village. And so they asked Senekerim to write this book. Now, Harry tells me that the guy wrote the book, published it, and then the Nirzes were not very happy with it because half the book is not about Nirze. It's about their own family, the Khederian family and the related family. Now, there is a weakness in the book, but on the other hand, it is one of its most important values because the author talks about the family, the various members, generations, and who did what, and who came to the States and why, who left the family and went off, and the mother dying of sickness, the father leaving for a while, one uncle becoming a revolutionary fedai and being chased by the government, being put in prison, the sister being tortured because the brother is a revolutionary, they can't catch him. So this is really micro history at its best, although the book was not intended to be one. So instead of the generalities, we have this very specific evolution of a family and how it falls apart. That's one of the most important characteristics of the book. Now, there are a couple of incidents that he talks about. For example, how the village came together in the church to choose a priest. So the priest was being elected by the villagers and there are two camps, as always, two Güzelsu. One favors one character to become a priest and the other party supports another. And in this battle, there is something from which, you know, the Republicans in this country must have learned. That is, the one party that knows the other has a lot of young people who will vote for a character, they propose not to allow votes for anyone under 25. Because if that's the case, then their candidate will win. So this, what's happening here in this country is not new. They learned it from the very capable Nirzes. There's the story of a relative of theirs from 1820 who was known as someone who minted money, Ottoman money, voski, the gold pound, and that it was fake.
Yeah.
And he did it with two friends. And then the government came to realize what was happening, and they caught the two, and they hanged the two. The government did. The third escaped to Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem, the story goes from what the family and the villagers heard was that their relative met the king of Ethiopia in Jerusalem on pilgrimage, convinced him that he was a very good financier, and went with him to Ethiopia. And the story goes, he became a minister of interior with millions of dollars, and then he left 200 million British pounds to his family in the village. And of course, you know, that was not very likely. So we did some research, and the research showed that he escaped. There was no king who visited Ethiopia. but there were some Ethiopians. He went with them, and he was a jeweler there with good connections in Ethiopia. So there's folklore, there's lore, there's real stories, and there are crooks, and there are thieves, and there are revolutionaries, all out of a village that is relatively well-to-do, not too many poor people. Khederian has two very valuable documents in there. One is the list of all the families, Armenian families of Nirze, in the family name and the head of the family, but also the number of members of that family, and also the wealth of that family in gold pounds. And you can see the discrepancy between the very poor and the very rich, although most people are middle income families. But as the story goes, by the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, the economic distress causes the unemployment of young men or employment that didn't make sense. So many of them start going to Istanbul, but also once the US opens up, one of them comes in, then others follow. But also he has done a listing of all Nirzes in the United States before the war. And that's very important because, and then he has a chapter on how they lived. The list is names, town, and age. So you could see what is the age of people that's disappearing from the village. This is of huge significance because when in 1915, the massacres, deportations, what we now term as genocide started, and there was no resistance, part of the reason is that we had no young men to resist.
Wow.
In 1895-96, there's a big debate whether they should, there are massacres. Somehow Nirze is saved. There's not many who are saved. But in 1908, when there's the possibility, the villagers come together and try to decide what they should do in case the mob attacks them. And they decide that the rich should pay tax to buy weapons to defend the village. And the rich refuse. So there's so much that is discussed and decided locally in terms of what happens to them and to the village. Now, I think just to end this portion, to end my presentation, and I'll be happy to answer questions, there's an aspect to this book that may be the most important. Many of you are aware of the hundreds of books that were written, published, usually edited, but sometimes written by one, about various villages and towns and provinces in historic Armenia and in Giligia, in Cilicia. There may be at least 200, possibly 400, depending on what you classify as a Hayrenakzagan Kirk or compatriotic union. It's a whole genre that has not been used as well as it could have been in the writing of history, but certainly in anthropology, in ethnology, in ethnography, in the study of dialects. This book, Senekerim's book, The Brief History of Nirze, appears to be the first of its kind of a compatriotic book. Written in 1917 as the village is being destroyed, and published in Armenian in 1980. So it is fascinating as to how it begins a whole genre of literature in Armenian historiography and in sources that try to capture what was lost, to put on a piece of paper their dialect, the names of families, the names of those who were lost, the songs, but this one doesn't have it. This is not as developed. It is the first, and he is not the intellectual type who could have done all of that. But he does have the history of the village. He does have the families of the village. He does have the problems of the village and how it fares in various important times, beginning in the ancient times, but also in 1895-96, during the Young Turk Revolution of 1908. And then as we get to 1914, 15, and the correspondence ends. One other point, which maybe Harry can cover more, is that many of these Nirzetsis who were here ended up going back as Gamavors in the Armenian Legion. About 1,100 from the US, Nirzetsis, and of course from Harpertsis and Vanetsis, they went back to Cyprus. They were trained under the French, under the British, and then they participated in the war, and some were killed, some came back. And Harry has known many, many of them personally, including the author and his family. So I will stop here, and as I said, we'll be happy to listen to Harry and then answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Jared. That's a very, very good coverage of the book. Of course, Harry brings a different aspects of the book as a Nirzetsi and someone who, in some ways, sees a certain continuity of the village and its identity, and Turkey. What kind of circle of Nirzetsis or Gesaratis are there, say, in the United States today? Does this kind of book resonate outside of immediate families? I mean, what kind of relationship do you have? Is there a Nirzetsi identity? And of course, how do this type of literature also relate to the people who live in Nirze today? Because in many ways, this is part of their history too, right? Armenians were half the village or more than half the village. How do the Turkish population there, how do they see Armenians? How do they remember Armenians? How much of that folklore that Khederian talks about in his village, about landmarks and places and events, how much of that knowledge is in their own oral or written traditions? I know that some new books have come up. Can you give us some insights of you as a Nirzetsi, how you relate to a book like this, and as well as to the village of Nirze today in Turkey? Are you still there, Harry?
He's muted.
Rather than he didn't hear me. Okay, Harry, can you unmute yourself? Or?
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now? Oh, thank you. Thanks. My son is here. Otherwise, we would have a problem. I've been to Nirze many times, and I've enjoyed myself there. I've usually gone there with a gentleman friend of mine who's Turkish, who knows all about what has happened to the Armenians in Gesaria. He doesn't speak English, and my Turkish isn't the best, but we have a great time together. So he has taken me around to Nirze, to Evkere, Buncusun, Bancusun, just name it. So I'm very, very fortunate to have that friend. And in the meantime, what has happened is that I've introduced him to this other gentleman, Sinan Mordak, who was just recently written a book about Nirze. I met Sinan in Istanbul 2 years ago, and he just found out about the Armenians, and we're on WhatsApp all the time. And like I said, he's written a book lately, and I've sent him tons of information. Lisa has also sent him lots of information. And he has incorporated that in his book. And I'll just show you, this book has recently been published. This is the book that he just published. And there are many pictures of the Nirzetsis and so forth that are in this book. I relate in what way? You know, the first time I went into Nirze, I think was in 1975. And it was like, you know, we've all heard about the old country, but to be able to go, and the person who took me was a Turkish young gentleman who was a leader of a climb that we were going to climb Mount Ararat. And then when we were in Gesaria, I said, my father comes from a village over here, Nirze. So he found out, we went there, and for me to be able to walk on the same stones that my father and his family walked on was very telling. There's a Turkish author by the name of Elif Shafak, and she said, listen to the stories beneath your feet. And that was very telling for me, because as I walked on it, I know that my father and his family had walked on it, and for me to be able to do that was very emotional. So Senekerim Khederian, I knew, because as a child, he had a restaurant on Bigelow Avenue in Watertown. As a matter of fact, his grandson, Rich Afrikan, is on this as well right now. So he had a restaurant, and we used to have the Nirze meetings were held there occasionally in the restaurant on Sundays. Aside from that, to know these gentlemen, for example, the guys and so forth, and now being able to relate to them and their youth, it's like I said, when I went to Nirze, it was like seeing my father when he was like a teenager, because he came to the United States in 1911. My mother had gone through the genocide from Afghanistan, but to see what they had done. There was a picture you had shown earlier about the Gama Wars. If you can bring that picture up, I would appreciate it. I'll show you an interesting thing here. The gentleman in the back row, the second from the right, is Vahan Khederian. Vahan Khederian was a brother of Senekerim Khederian, who wrote the book. It's amazing. Senekerim was a Tashnag, Vahan was a Rangavan, and he was a leader of a group. He was very brave. And the gentleman just in front of Vahan was Stepanaga. Stepanaga, if you look at his fingers, the right hand fingers, you'll only see 3 fingers there, because what happened to him was that when he had a Turkish guy, soldier, whatever it was, came over and he had his hands over his head, and the Turkish soldier came in with a sword and lopped off his finger. So you'll see that very distinctly, that Stepanaga has only got 3 fingers there, not 4. So, like I said, I knew all these gentlemen, and I have so much appreciation from them now, because Senekerim's sister used to write letters to him. They're so compassionate. The love that expressed by Senekerim's sister, Nuba, which is Richard Afrikan's mother, is so telling in the book, you know, and that Senekerim also, like I said, was very thing about having all this history in there. Senekerim's sister, Nuvar, was married to Kaspar Mudurian. Now, as a kid, I knew that Kaspar Mudurian used to come around, and they used to call him Enişte. And then to know the relationship between all these guys when they lived together in one apartment in Watertown and so forth, it gave me a greater appreciation of what they had gone through. Here they are in America, safe and sound, and knowing what their families were going through in Turkey. And I guess a lot of that information came through the missionaries, because they tried to get information through their sources. It was difficult, but the missionaries there were in touch with, I guess, the State Department. And that's why you had the Gamavors going to Turkey to do their best for their homeland.
Harry,
Yes.
one thing that Girard didn't touch on, and I think he sort of intimate, part of during this period, of course, many were exiled or murdered, but a large number of missionaries reported a large number of Armenian children and women who were left behind, who had to intermarry, who had to assimilate. And in fact, before today's event, I got an email from a Kurdish woman I know here. She said there are some Gesaratsi Alevi Turks here, or Kurds, who have Armenian ancestry from that era. How discernible is that element when you go to places like Nirze? Are there people who come who say, my grandmother or my great-grandmother, is originally Armenian? Do you come into that kind of discussion? Because of course they have to be there, and they were described by, in fact, they are even described by Ottoman sources. The number of Armenians, about 10%, who were disseminated amongst the Muslim population. That means that every village should have some descendants of these people. Have you come across them?
I have a Turkish friend, a professor of political science. He writes in Agos as well. And he said, Harry, everybody east of Ankara has got Armenian blood in them.
Yeah.
So I said to him, no, Baskin, everybody east of Izmir has got Armenian blood in them, because the Armenians were all over the place. So that, yes, in fact, they do have blood. But what has happened when they emptied out the villages there, what they did is they brought the Muslims from the Balkans.
Yeah. Because
there was a big strength of Muslims in the Balkans. They are probably former Christians at one time, but they became Muslims, Islam, and they are the ones who came and occupied the homes that the Armenians lived in. That's why they deported the Armenians, and like I said, they brought those people down from the Balkans. So somewhere along the line, everybody's got some Armenian blood in them.
And how much local knowledge is there about Armenians that Turks have within their own tradition? Is this something that comes out, that you find out things that you didn't know before from Turkish natives?
Well, in news, no, but there was an article I had written about this woman who was from Efkere, my mother's village. And it so happened that when they were on their deportation route, this Turkish gentleman came over and said, I will save you folks if you give me a daughter. Daughter was my mother's age, okay, like 18, 19 years old, and he knew the family and whatnot. And so they said, if we don't give her, we're gonna die. And if we give her, we don't know what's gonna happen. So anyway, they gave the daughter to Ahmed, and they had a child. And the child I, by coincidence, met. And when I went to Turkey and met her through, long story made short, I stood at her house, I met her sons and so forth, and a wonderful, wonderful lady. And I had visited her a number of times. She had passed away, and I asked my friend who knows all about the Armenians of Turkey, I'd like to go to the grave. So we found the grave, just a mound of dirt. And I said a prayer, I said the Haile in Armenian for her mother, and because her mother had fled as soon as, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to say that when the British landed in Istanbul or Constantinople, the Turks were frightened, and they said, don't do to us what we did to you. So this gentleman brought his daughter back to the family and said, I want to return your daughter. So one of the ladies there with the family that was saved said, look, Ahmed, you have a son, because he had a son from the first wife, and you don't have a daughter. So take your daughter and you'll have a son and a daughter, thinking that perhaps nobody would marry her because she had a son from a Turkish person. So I met that woman, a wonderful, wonderful lady. And she knew that, her father was a Turk and her mother was Armenian. That was the only incident that I had met, but I've heard of many situations where that has been so. There's half Armenians. The hidden Armenians is how they're referred to. They're not accepted by the Turks or the Muslims because of their Armenian upbringing. They're not accepted by the Armenians because they're Muslims. So it's a terrible situation for them to be in.
Right. I'll ask my last question before I open it up. You said you've been going there since 1975. Have you seen a discernible difference in people's attitude towards you as an Armenian from that era when there was virulent anti-Armenian diatribes to, shall we say, more recent times? Have you seen a difference?
No, I've had a wonderful time in Turkey, I have to tell you that. But you must also realize that Turks are afraid of Turks, okay? Turks are afraid of Turks. So that, but I haven't encountered that. I've worked with the Hrant Dink Foundation there because I just felt that Hrant Dink was the Martin Luther King, he was the Gandhi and so forth of Turkey. What a great human rights person. And the Turkish friends that I have are mostly academicians and journalists. And some are in prison, some have fled the country, but friends of Hrant Dink's, and that's who I've worked with. I have not encountered any animosity to me at any time, and I don't look to do that, you know. So that's this kind of circle that I travel in.
That's great. Let me open the forum. Are there any questions that other listeners want to ask either of our two speakers? I'm not sure how that would work. Anything? Jonathan, does this stuff chime in with your experience with Efkere, which is what, next door to Nirze, right? By chance, we launched or relaunched a book on Nirze as well a few weeks ago. Not Nirze, sorry, Efkere, another set of letters describing what was going on there up to 1915. Any sort of comments along those lines? You have read the Nirze book, yes? I think you have.
Yes, I have. No, I have nothing to add. I'm grateful that it's released. Harry is, Harry is not only a friend, but through DNA testing, we found out that we're actually related. So his mother's family is from the same street as my family, and so it's great to see this book out as well. Nothing to add, really. We're sister cities, and it's great to see that. That northeast corridor, that northeast area above Kayseri is so rich with these villages, and it's nice to see them finally getting documented.
Yeah, I think document is one thing. It's another one being studied and brought alive is something different, right? From an academic perspective, but also what you do, which is going and working in these areas with the knowledge that you're bringing in. It's a sort of peacemaking. I'm myself involved with that as well, is building those bridges at a local level and trying to see what we can salvage of what's left and opening new doors of coming to terms with a terrible past, but perhaps not so terrible future. I don't know what your thoughts are. Last week, some of our speakers were a bit pessimistic with what's going on in Turkey today. But I've also had very similar experience as Harry. It's a question of how you talk to people, how you, in some ways, you disarm them from their own prejudices. I haven't said this to you, but I went to Efkere about 2007, and we walked in the village. In the morning, everybody stayed away from us. It was supposedly a right-wing village, MHP voters. By the afternoon, we're having tea with each other. You sort of bring down those barriers, and by talking like human beings, by showing, well, yes, we know what the past is about, but we're not here. It's not about vengeance. It's about coming to terms with it. That's a positive experience I have, and I think you had. And Harry, of course, we're careful how you go about it, but surely this will be a good outcome between these compatriotic studies. 1915 and of course us today, and I get very frustrated when there's a lack of Armenians willing to actually go there, to be learned. It's not enough saying my grandmother came here or you hate Turks. It's about knowing what the score is and having a bit of a diplomacy in your voice to start that process going. But I mean, Harry speaks positive terms, and you do, and I do, but I wish we could get the message out there more and get more youngsters to go there. They say, what about Armenia, Karabakh and so forth? Well, if we want peace with Turkey, this is one area in which we can be active with civil society, getting rid of the violence, getting rid of the stereotypes. And so I'm flattered that we published these books. This is the third one in Gesaria region, we did one on Tomarza, because I actually see an important role of this type of scholarship in public diplomacy inside of Turkey today, as long as, of course, there are people willing to do this type of work. It's not a lost cause. you know, this isn't the end. And these books are like epitaphs, you know, these are the tombstones that we are putting on our ancestors and walking away. I hate to think of them that way, but sometimes I feel that is how people see it. You know, they don't even read the books, and that's a shame.
Ara, can I add
Yes,
a couple
yes,
of
Richard.
points?
Yes, sure.
One is that we forgot to mention that Harry himself has authored a book on Nirze. He has benefited from Khederian's work and other works, and it also includes a number of texts that give you his impressions of his visits.
Right.
So the past comes to be the present. The second point is to what you were talking about, and that is, it has always fascinated me that, you know, you take Nirze, a village where there were Turks, and a long time ago there were many more Greeks,
Yes.
apparently, but mainly by 1890s, 1880s, there were Turks and Armenians fundamentally. Now, this is the same village. It's a small area. They all are part of the same economy. They till the same land. They eat the same meat from the same lamb and whatever. They know each other. They are in the marketplace together. In this book, there's the incident of owning shops together. So and they are in the same government, being impacted at some level the same way, at another level differently.
Yeah.
And yet what each one takes from this is so isolated. That is, for example, Khederian's book is a good example. He does not talk about Turkish families in the village.
Right.
Well, we know that they were there, but what he's trying to save is his people, his memories, his family, the Armenian families and the memories of Armenian church and school. And the Turks do the same. So from the same land, you end up with two different histories. And that history does not reflect that which was common, but reflects that which came to be different. And this impacts the way we receive news. For example, when you're a Turk in Nirze and you're very sensitive to this issue that there were Armenians there, you may want to shut that out from your memory and your history so that you don't feel guilty every day. But you also find fault with Armenians. And if you can find fault with Armenians today, then you are even happier. And you find fault with Armenians today with the Armenian Justice Commandos and Asala. You say Armenians were bad people. And then you mention Garapa, although you don't even know what Garapa is. You mention because it makes you feel at home, you're in a safe zone. And you don't see and hear, and if you see and hear anything that is positive, you have a difficult time getting to it. And Armenians, when they hear news about Turkey, they will not hear anything that may be positive, but they will grasp immediately. The software is set to grasp anything that is said in Turkey that is negative, or anything that is done that is negative. That registers better. So books like these, I think, when they are completed by others, such as Sinan Morda's book and Harry's book, then they provide a modicum of understanding. And this has little to do with politics. What is Turkey's position on Garapa? What is Armenia's position on Garapa in Turkey? This has something to do of history on the level of peoples, which is as important because this is a reflection of not only the past, but also our own present attitudes, prejudices, and in some cases of our hopes for some kind of understanding, in which case a better politics becomes possible.